And perhaps let me describe what will be the program of tonight. Basically, first of all, perhaps as a preliminary remark, for the coming weeks when we'll have our lectures, the lectures will aim to start at 6 o'clock sharp, because it's a full program, and I suspect that we will also want to have some time for discussion always between 7 and 8 o'clock somewhere. So what I'll try to do today is give a little bit the background of the evolution of the international cooperation on climate change and the role of the EU in that evolution. So as to situate the whole lecture series program in this overall political and legal context. Perhaps to start with a few questions so that I know the audience better. Who knows the abbreviation UNFCCC? You have watched the movie before. IPCC. Annex 1 countries? That's always the same people. CDM? Always the same, okay. JI? ECCP. Well, the others will learn more about these abbreviations this evening, I can assure you. A brief overview of, by way of introduction, I'll briefly give an overview over the milestones of international climate policy since the beginning of the 90s, end of the 80s, basically. Then go into what the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, basically contains, as far as it is relevant for our lecture series, obviously. Then go towards the Kyoto Protocol, then talk about EU leadership on international climate policy during this whole evolution, the creation of the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol, and then move towards addressing more the future, towards what's called nowadays the Copenhagen Agreement that we may aim at next year at the international level, and the EU role in that process. So let me start, if it goes, yes, with the milestones of international climate policy. Perhaps just to recall, obviously we're looking at a history now of 20 years, basically, of international climate policy. There was the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the major international scientific body addressing climate change, in 1988, established by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Programme. Then was the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that was negotiated basically in 1991 and 1992. And then signed at the Rio Earth Summit that year. In 1997, we have the Kyoto Protocol. Obviously, we'll come back to the contents of these instruments later on. In 2001, the so-called Marrakesh Accords, that's implementing provisions for the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol had lots of provisions, articles that needed to be fleshed out to be implementable, and that occurred 2001 in Marrakesh. Then 2005 we saw the entry into force of the Kyoto Protocol, first without the US and Australia. As is widely known, Australia subsequently joined last year, at the end of last year. And then we had at in 2007, last year, at the end of last year, the so-called Bali Roadmap or Bali Action Plan that was agreed, that sets out basically the process, the ambition to come to a new global agreement on climate change in Copenhagen at the end of next year. So that just gives you a very broad overview of some of the milestones in the history of international climate policy. Let's go to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's known also for its objective that's contained in its Article 2. That is basically the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And then, okay, the article goes on and gives some indications what that could mean. And that basically translates according to current scientific knowledge, into the need for a global GHG, greenhouse gas emission reduction, of at least 50% by 2050, and then a further reduction after that date. That's basically what it means. That's not contained in the treaty, that's obviously interpretation, but that's what it broadly is understood to mean today. Then it contains a number of principles contained in Article 3 in particular, and you will perhaps not know this abbreviation, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which is basically the major principle that's more and more structuring international environmental policy and law. It refers to the fact, obviously, that there are different responsibilities of countries in the south, countries in the north, but also in between these groups. And as the addition at the end says, also different capacities, different capabilities of these countries to address climate change. And that is the principle. The principle is that this should be taken into account in elaborating any obligations, any commitments, any action that needs to be taken by different countries. The UNFCCC also lays the basis for a comprehensive approach, as it is known. It says all greenhouse gas emissions basically should be addressed, all sources of these gases, all sinks. Sinks like forests, where carbon may be stored from the atmosphere. And it contains a number of general commitments. A commitment to report emission figures, to review these reports also, to establish plans, to establish generally policies and measures to address climate change, some financing rules for giving some assistance to developing countries for fulfilling their commitments. What's noticeable and notable is that the UNFCCC does not contain any specific targets for reducing emissions. That was the big discussion back then. We'll come back to that when we come to the EU. The EU was pushing for a stabilization target for industrialized countries to stabilize their CO2 emissions in the year 2000 at the level of 1990. That was not successful. There's some treaty language in there that says industrialized countries should somehow aim to possibly achieve that. In a long sentence that I'll not read. Then that has been, I think, also characterized by one analyst as the most incomprehensible treaty language ever. It's a very long sentence, and at the end you ask yourself, what does it mean? As I said, it says roughly something, these countries should somehow aim at achieving their target, but it does not really set this target. Nevertheless, the Convention is a basis for also our current discussions at the international level on climate policies. It establishes a number of actors in the sense of parties first, and that developed industrialized countries are contained and listed in Annex 1 of the Convention. So that's what the term Annex 1 countries then refers to. It refers to the OECD countries that are also separately listed then in Annex 2 of the Convention, because they have particular financial obligations, and countries with economies in transition. Countries with economies in transition are basically the formerly communist, socialist countries of Middle and Eastern Europe. They are marked by an asterisk in this annex, but they are in Annex 1. So Annex 1 countries are basically what's known as industrialized countries, OECD countries, and formerly communist countries. And then we have all the countries that are not in Annex 1. They are the non-Annex 1 countries, obviously. They are the developing countries. And then there's lots of subcategories established, especially in Articles 4.8 and 4.9 of the Convention, for those of you who want to study the Convention text, of low-lying countries, countries that are particularly prone to drought, etc., etc., etc. A number of countries, country categories listed there. And then, if we look at international climate policy, we have a number of actors that are not governments, not countries, not parties to the Convention. We have, first of all, the Secretariat that is established by the Convention and is seated in Bonn, the Climate Change or Climate Secretariat. We have a number of IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, including the IPCC that I've mentioned, and the GEF, the Global Environment Facility. I'll come back to that also briefly on the next slide, I think. And we have a number of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that are active in the field, and one should know that these play a role. Environmental ones, business organizations, research organizations, etc. The UNFCCC also establishes an institutional structure. It establishes a conference of the parties. That's broadly known as COPs. So if you hear other speakers during the coming weeks talking about COPs, that's the conference of the parties, usually to the UNFCCC. That's what will take place next year in Copenhagen. That is what took place last year in Bali. These are COPs, conferences of the parties. It establishes two subsidiary bodies for scientific and technological advice, commonly referred to as SubStar, and a subsidiary body for implementation, the SBI. These are basically mini-COPs. Subsidiary bodies where also all the parties, all the countries are represented and discuss subsets of themes that are otherwise also discussed by the COP. Then I already mentioned the Secretariat, established by Article 8, and the financial mechanism, which is operated on an interim basis by the Global Environment Facility, the GEF. Lots of abbreviations and names. You'll find the slides later on the website, I think. So if you overall assess the UNFCCC, then I think it's fair to say it's relatively weak commitments, no targets as mentioned. It establishes an objective and principles that structure somehow the further elaboration of international climate policy and law. And it establishes also a platform and institutional structure for the future development. And basically, overall, it's called a framework convention and establishes a framework for the creation of obligations later on, as happened with the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol. We'll come to that in a minute. And the development of this regime is possible through the COP that can take decisions. Obviously, the parties can take decisions every year. They can adopt additional protocols that are binding under international law, or they could adopt an amendment to the convention. What they've done, obviously, so far is that they have adopted the Kyoto Protocol, and we come to that. The Kyoto Protocol of 1997 now establishes for the first time reduction targets. First time quantitative targets for reducing and limiting greenhouse gas emissions in industrialized countries. The overall target is roughly a -5% for all industrialized countries, relative to the 1990 level. And this overall target is differentiated for individual countries. You see, no, come back to that later. I'll have a slide later on where you see which individual targets all the different industrialized countries have. It establishes 1990 as the base year, basically. It's always the reference. Reduction 10%, 20%. If you look at the current discussions in the EU about reducing emissions 20% by 2020, come back to that later on also, in the climate energy package proposed by the Commission and first established the target by the European Council, it's always relative to 1990. That's kind of the base year that is established in the Kyoto Protocol also for the targets. It refers to a commitment period 2008 to 2012. So we are in the first year of this commitment. So these reductions don't need to be achieved in one particular year, but over this 5-year period. So you take this 5-year period, add all the emissions that you have as a country, divided by 5, and get an average. And if that is then for the EU minus 8%, then you have achieved your target. And it covers a basket of GHGs, of greenhouse gases, that basically embodies the major greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gases. CO2, carbon dioxide, that's well known, methane, N2O, and perhaps a little bit less known, hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, perfluorocarbons, PFCs, and SF6. These are industrial gases that are produced for certain applications, like HFCs can be used as refrigerants in refrigerators. And these are also greenhouse gases. The whole basket is contained in the Kyoto Protocol and regulated by the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol also allows for the counting of sinks. So you can basically make an effort to have reforestation or halt deforestation, and you can get credit for that when accounting for your emissions. If you plant trees, there's a certain calculation that you can make then in your reporting, and that can be offset against your emissions when you when the calculation is made, whether you have made your target or not. Perhaps one of the also really innovative elements of the Kyoto Protocol is the market mechanisms that it establishes. To perhaps start with the last one, emissions trading. That's obviously well known now in the EU. We have an EU emissions trading system. What it means is basically that you can sell and buy emissions between developed countries under the Kyoto Protocol. When you establish your target for the EU minus 8%, that means that you should, in the commitment period, only emit 92% of your base year, right? That means you get an amount assigned to you of 92%. The EU gets 92% of its base year emissions. 92%, that's your assigned amount. That's how it is called under the Kyoto Protocol. And therefore, these units under emissions trading are called AAUs, assigned amount units. Each of these units is equivalent to 1 ton of CO2. So their industrialized countries can trade parts of their assigned amounts in between themselves, as they need those assigned amount units to account for their emissions. Two further mechanisms are project-based. One is JI, that stands for Joint Implementation. What you can do there basically is you do projects in another industrialized country. So two industrialized countries join forces, and they do a project to reduce emissions. And then they can share the emission credits that are generated by that mechanism. So let's say Great Britain goes to Russia, perhaps not the most likely scenario these days, and says, let's do a nice emission reduction project. You have this old power station there, we'll replace it, we'll build a new one that will reduce emissions. And the difference is 5 million tons, we get 3 million, and you get 2 million, plus you have a modern power station. That could be a JI project. And you can do similar projects under the Clean Development Mechanism with developing countries. So developed countries can cooperate with developing countries, do these kinds of projects, gain emission credits that they can offset against their emission target. For the Clean Development Mechanism, there's the additional condition that these projects should support sustainable development in developing countries, obviously. Should not just serve to reduce emissions, but also further sustainable development in these countries. This is a picture, I don't know how well one can see that, that summarizes a little bit how emissions trading, joint implementation, and the clean development mechanism operate. Basically what you see here is emissions trading. If a part of the assigned amount of this party is sold to the party in the middle, it moves over there. This party is not allowed to emit that part of its assigned amount anymore. But this party is allowed to emit more. So overall, the emissions of these two parties should stay the same. The same actually with JI, joint implementation, in between industrialized countries. Whenever industrialized countries do these projects together, and they transfer their emission credits, so that party A, that was the Great Britain example, does a project with Russia, gets emission credits, they actually need to be deducted from the assigned amount of Russia. So the overall emissions remain the same. It's a question where the emissions occur. That is different for the clean development mechanism, because developing countries don't have quantitative targets under the Kyoto Protocol. So you do emissions reduction projects with developing countries that can lead to an increased overall emission in industrialized countries. That's this dark part that comes from a developing country. Obviously, according to the theory and according to the concept, that will nevertheless lead globally to an emission reduction because it will reduce emissions in developing countries. But to actually make certain that that really occurs is not so easy. And some recent studies actually show that a lot of these emissions credits that are transferred are not really reduced in full in developing countries. So that's as an illustration. So what you gain through the CDM is that you can emit more in the industrialized country that actually acquires those emission credits. What's also clear is that all these mechanisms are basically enhancing the efficiency of the overall effort. But they don't produce additional emission reductions. They are an implementation tool to actually achieve the emission reductions where they are cheapest. And in theory, obviously, if they are as cheap as possible, you can also achieve more emission reductions. But as such, these mechanisms do not reduce emissions. And then I'll not go into detail on a lot of more what is contained in the Kyoto Protocol. There are provisions on reporting and review. Obviously, countries need to report their emissions, and then, okay, one may have a certain incentive to perhaps report more emissions in the base year and less emissions in the target years than are really there. So there needs to be a review of these reports of emissions. There's a whole system of review in place. There are compliance provisions. There's a compliance committee established that steps in the case that there are allegations or suspicions that countries don't fulfill their commitments. There are provisions on financial assistance to developing countries. A number of funds have been created. There are provisions on technology transfer. There are provisions on adaptation, and we'll have a session on adaptation also, including also a fund, an adaptation fund. There are provisions on capacity building. There is discussion about impact of response measures. That's what the impacts that emission reduction policies, for example, in the EU could have on certain developing countries in particular. Like if we start really reducing our oil consumption, how that could drive down the oil price on the world market, and how that would affect OPEC countries. That's a discussion that's going on there. And there are more issues. What that tells you is it's a pretty complicated instrument. Perhaps also for illustration at this point, this is the UNFCCC. This is the amount of regulation that's there, not that impressive perhaps. This is Kyoto Protocol, pretty much the same. But I was talking about the implementing rules that were adopted since then. And this is what's basically the Marrakesh Accords. And that's small print. That's small print. So it's quite a bit of regulation that has been passed in all these areas. So it's a pretty complicated system by now. Institutional framework, briefly, also to make the point again that it's getting pretty complicated at the international level. First of all, the protocol in its decision-making bodies pretty much draws upon the convention. So there's the same secretariat, there are the same subsidiary bodies, and there is also the COP, but it's called differently. It's called Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties. So here, the COP, as we know, then is called frequently COP-MOP, and the COP-MOP is dealing with the protocol issues, not the convention issues. And there's the same financial mechanism. So there's formally a distinction between the COP and the COP-MOP. All these nice abbreviations, which in reality frequently doesn't make that much of a difference. There is something called the Executive Board of the CDM that elaborates all kinds of rules and manages this CDM mechanism that I mentioned before. There is a JI supervisory committee that does pretty much the same for the JI project-based mechanism. There's a compliance committee, I mentioned that. There's for this adaptation fund, a whole adaptation fund board. And there are more groups, but I spare you those. So also pretty complicated institutional structure by now. Overall assessment of the Kyoto Protocol is certainly that the first step is done by the Kyoto Protocol, but the reduction commitments that are included in there are certainly insufficient. If you compare it with what I said at the beginning, by 2050 you need a global reduction of at least 50% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. And then you have in the Kyoto Protocol as a first step 5% in industrialized countries, which basically means it's globally still an increase. But obviously one can't, one has to do the first step first, and then the second, and then the third. In that sense, it's going in the right direction. There's certainly a solid and flexible institutional structure to build on, including these innovations, emissions trading, CDM, JI, the whole reporting system. And the whole system, I would say, that's my own judgment, obviously, is currently without a credible alternative. So even if you say it's pretty complicated and why don't we do something else, there's not something else out there that could be used. And we see over time this increasing functional and political differentiation and the complexity of this governance system at the international level. Different greenhouse gases, sinks, that obviously require a whole lot of regulation, how you actually report on sinks and verify that carbon is stored in sinks. Co-reporting, the market mechanisms, compliance, adaptation, lots of more. I'll come back to that. That's the Kyoto Protocol. Perhaps I continue still with the EU leadership in that phase, and then perhaps we have a little break for perhaps some questions. We have the EU in the UNFCCC negotiations already establishing itself as an international leader. As I mentioned before, they were pushing in 1991, 1992 for a stabilization target for industrialized countries by 2000. Again, already then with 1990 as the base year, but were not successful, in particular because of resistance of the US and the EU-US conflict has certainly been, throughout the history of international climate policy, one of the structuring conflicts and tensions in the field. If you go on to the Kyoto negotiations, the negotiations on the Kyoto Protocol, the EU was actually pushing for the highest reduction target again there. They were pushing for a 15% emission reduction of industrialized countries by 2010, and then even added an interim step the first step, obviously, one would have to achieve 7.5% by 2005. That again was by far the most ambitious target that any other big country was pursuing. I think the next one was Japan that had a target of, proposed a target that would translate into an emission reduction of 3, 4, 5%, if I remember correctly. Then we had the US that said at that stage basically a stabilization might be feasible. The EU then also accepted in the Kyoto Protocol indeed the strongest target among the major players, and that's where we have that summary of the targets, the quantitative targets in the Kyoto Protocol. So you see VEC, as it is called in the Kyoto Protocol context, European Community, and it's then 15 member states that all have the target minus 8% by 2008 to 2012. Together with a number of countries, lots of which are now also members of the EU, as you can see. Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Liechtenstein, not member of the EU, Lithuania, Monaco also not, but then Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, and lastly Switzerland, which is obviously also not an EU member state. So these have the target of minus 8%. The US minus 7%. Japan, Canada, Hungary, Poland minus 6%. Croatia minus 5%. Then a few countries with a stabilization target. New Zealand, Russian Federation, Ukraine. And 3 countries with an increase. And as I said, if you add all this up with the emission figures, then you get an overall industrial country target of roughly minus 5%. The negotiation back then basically was between the EC, the US, and Japan, which fought very hard in Kyoto and arrived at this 876 formula. And basically all the other countries added their pledges, more or less, what they would do. So some of the European ones said, okay, we'll take what the EU offered, and some of the others, the Russian Federation, just said, we don't do anything more than stabilization. That's how these targets were negotiated back then. So, so as you can see, perhaps, well, also leading in that sense the crowd by taking the toughest target. This whole EU policy, and that's also interesting and relevant for today, is based on an internal burden sharing agreement. And many of you will have heard of that. That basically meant, yeah, the EU and the 15 member states then said, okay, we commit to minus 8, but only collectively, because we have very different countries, poorer countries, the southern countries, that may perhaps need an emission increase, other countries that may be able to reduce more. So the EU came up internally with this burden sharing agreement that was negotiated and agreed in 1998 and then codified in 2002 when the EU decided to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And it was then communicated under Article 4 of the Kyoto Protocol, if you want to read that one, to the Secretariat, and is now binding on the EU member states, the old EU member states, under international law, also under Article 4 of the Kyoto Protocol. So you see quite a huge differentiation. I think the highest increase is for Portugal, if I'm correct, plus 27, and the highest reduction is Luxembourg, minus 28, which is obviously a small country. If you look at the bigger ones, in terms of emissions, you have Germany with minus 21, you have France with the stabilization, and you have the UK with the reduction of minus 12.5. So that analyzes the whole implementation of the Kyoto Protocol today. And it actually also sets the stage for a new effort sharing that is in the making in the new climate energy package that's currently under negotiation that contains now it's called effort sharing, not burden sharing anymore. That also contains an effort sharing among the now 27 EU member states. So, what we also have in the 1990s in this first phase of international climate policy is very little effective implementing measures in the EU. So you see the EU pushing at the international level, saying we want to do more, we want all of us to do more, but then internally it did not really succeed in implementing a whole lot of measures that would reduce its own emissions. The first discussions began at the beginning of the 1990s in the context of the UNFCCC, when there was a proposal by the Commission to introduce a CO2 energy tax that failed eventually. Obviously, taxation measures have to be adopted by unanimity in the Council of Ministers, and the UK then blocked that mainly, but several others also had their problems. In addition, there were a number of programs. The SAFE program for targeting energy efficiency, the Altena program targeting renewable energies, but these were substantially watered down also in the legislative process, so they were far less effective than proposed at the beginning. So there was relatively little. Then in the second half of the 1990s, there were a number of voluntary agreements with car manufacturers to reduce CO2 emissions, and that has been in the news obviously also because they have proven not to deliver. There was a target established of 140 milligrams or grams, or what is it, of CO2 per kilometer for new cars, and the European car industry at the moment is roughly at 160, and 2008 is the target here. And that has provided the basis for proposals to actually regulate CO2 emissions from cars. So there was relatively little ongoing. At the end of the 1990s, you could vote a few legislative acts like the Landfills Directive that actually helped to reduce methane emissions in the EU, but that was not adopted because of climate policy reasons. So anyway, what my conclusion is, in the 1990s, you can broadly talk about, I guess, rhetorical leadership of the EU. So pushing hard at the international level, but there was a credibility gap created because it didn't really follow up with own legislation, own measures that would prove that this emission reduction that we were striving for was doable, was implementable. So that was the situation in the 1990s. We had this one, we had that one. Then obviously came in 2001, first the US exit. The US abandoning the Kyoto Protocol. That was obviously a big crisis in which the EU certainly showed quite determined leadership to try to actually save the Kyoto Protocol. Because what was at stake then was, what was really the question was, does it make sense to go forward with the Kyoto Protocol without the biggest emitter in the US? And the immediate reaction of the EU was to say, the European Council then also was to say, yes, we stick to the Kyoto Protocol, we implement it, we go forward with it, and the EU launched quite a remarkable diplomatic effort to actually convince other countries to join it in the effort to save the Kyoto Protocol. This US exit occurred during these negotiations on this, the Marrakesh Accords, the implementing provisions for the Kyoto Protocol, in which the EU generally had taken the line to defend the environmental integrity of the protocol, which means design the market mechanisms in a way that countries couldn't just buy their way out, but would also have to implement domestic measures. That was a big fight back then. To establish an effective compliance system that actually would make sure that industrialized countries really implement their commitments. And to the extent possible to limit the use of sinks, to the extent that perhaps also scientific uncertainty in how much forests, for example, take up from the atmosphere can be used to, again, calculate your way out of your commitments. So these were at least 3 big fights, and there were more back then. Obviously, this fight for environmental integrity got a little bit problematic also after the US exit, politically, and obviously Marc back then was very much involved in that, because some compromises needed to be made in Marrakesh to convince all the other countries who now suddenly all were pivotal players in the game, to convince them to come on board and agree to the Marrakesh Accords. So a number of compromises had to be made there to save the Kyoto Protocol and to get the others on board. But by and large, this international leadership role of the EU continued. Then there was the ratification campaign, the whole campaign to try to actually get all these countries, after the Marrakesh Accords had been adopted, to ratify the Kyoto Protocol and bring it into force. And there the last country was Russia, that was holding out quite a bit. And the EU again launched a diplomatic effort and actually made a package deal with Russia at that stage, and said, Russia, if you ratify the Kyoto Protocol, we'll support you in joining the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which seemed to have some effect because Russia then at the end of 2004 indeed ratified the Kyoto Protocol so that it entered into force in February 2005. At this same stage, we see that domestically also something happens in the EU. From the year 2000 onwards, one of the other abbreviations that I mentioned at the beginning, the European Commission launched something called the European Climate Change Programme, which was a program, as it says, a program to address climate change, to elaborate legislative measures, policies and measures to address climate change, including the famous Emissions Trading Directive. And I have a little overview here in this table of some of the measures taken since the end of the 1990s actually. The voluntary agreements with car manufacturers I mentioned before, the landfill directive I mentioned before. There is in 2001 a renewable energy directive. There's a directive on the promotion of biofuels. There is the emissions trading directive and regulations to actually link it with CDM and JI. There's a directive on energy end use efficiency and energy services, and there are a number of other measures that have been taken that you can see. So when you compare that to the beginning of the 1990s, it's quite a remarkable increase in legislative activity. Well, then you see the conclusion. It addresses the credibility gap that opened up before all these measures. But my conclusion is with limited impact on emissions. When you look here at the last column, you see, and that is from actually the European Commission, the figures, I've summarized them in a different way, but that's what in the publications they give as reduction potential. 10 megatons of CO2 equivalents. That means CO2 equivalence means that methane has another greenhouse gas effect than CO2, and all the other gases have different ones, but you can weigh them in a way that you can compare them with CO2. So megatons, well, it may not tell you a whole lot. If you look at the total, it's 515 to 615 megatons of CO2 reduction potential. For that, you should know that the overall CO2 greenhouse gas emissions of the EU 27 are around 5,000 megatons per year. And of the EU 15, if I'm not totally mistaken, it's 3,000. So that looks quite remarkable. Although it's also obviously also calculated against business as usual. So it's assuming, okay, otherwise emissions will grow from 3,000 to 3,300. And okay, we reduced by 600 and we are at 2,700. That would be more or less, if you calculate that number and look at it more carefully, that would be more or less sufficient to achieve the Kyoto target. Yeah, you can do the calculation and see how would emissions have evolved. The crux lies in the word potential up there. It's a reduction potential. So directives. Obviously it also depends on what's written in the directives, but we know that directives need to be implemented in the national laws of the member states. And if you look at the implementation, unfortunately the implementation is not always perfect. We already had the voluntary agreements, that's not a directive even, hasn't delivered the 75 to 80 megatons. The landfill directive, okay, that's more or less okay. But the others, if you look at the review of implementation of these directives, unfortunately, to date, these measures have not delivered their full potential. So in that sense, if you look at the emissions, we are not there yet at the Kyoto targets with these measures. More measures will be needed. So that's why the conclusion is addressing the credibility gap, but not really closing it yet. I should say, I'll come to the overall program of the lecture series obviously later on, and there will be, as you know, I assume you all have this little leaflet with the program. There will be sessions on several of these instruments, obviously. On the CO2 and cars issue, on the emissions trading, the directive system of the EU, etc. So I'm not going into details there. So what I should also say is a leadership dimension of the EU also that we'll also address in the lecture series is it's kind of international activeness, as political scientists call it. You know, the EU is obviously a strange animal in international relations. Who's the EU? The Commission, the member states, who is it? Who's acting? Otherwise you at least have, you have one government of the US and they negotiate with the US. In the EU it's the presidency, this member state, that member state, the Commission. It's a little bit more difficult. So the whole area of climate change is usually characterized as belonging to the mixed or shared competence shared between the EC, the European Community, and the member states. Which also means the EC is usually represented by the European Commission, the member states represent themselves. So both, or not both because it's indeed nowadays 28, are active at the international negotiating level. So that obviously poses a number of challenges for ensuring unity, ensuring that either only one speaks and all the others say yes, or everybody says the same, which is tricky, obviously. It raises the issue of representation. Who is actually representing the EU internationally? And how do you conduct effective negotiations and effective diplomacy in this context to actually pursue your common objectives to the extent that you have defined them? And obviously for the EU, the particular challenge there is also has always been that it has kind of two negotiating levels at the international level almost. It needs to negotiate among itself what it actually has as a position and as an objective and as a strategy. And then it needs to go out there to the world, to the negotiating partners, the other countries, and convince them that the EU's objectives are the right ones. That may sound trivial and not so difficult, but as you know, the day has 24 hours, and the negotiating day has in between 10 and 16 hours. And if the EU sits together for 12 hours negotiating among itself what its objectives are, then there's limited time to convince others. So there are trade-offs here. And that has been one of the problems. The other problem obviously being that perhaps you agree a position and you communicate it to the negotiating partners, but some member state perhaps has a little bit a different idea and communicates something different. So that's a unity issue. The EU has responded to that by developing a system of representation and internal coordination. And we'll have one session that addresses that in more detail. Suffice it to say here that basically the EU presidency represents in international negotiations the EU. That has also evolved over the years. At the beginning of the 1990s, it was also individual member states that sometimes took the floor in these negotiating fora. Nowadays, it's the presidency or representatives of the presidency. So they lead the coordination internationally and they formally represent. There's also a role for the EU Troika in this representation. The EU Troika was in the 1990s composed of the previous presidency, the current presidency, and the future presidency. That changed around the turn of this century or millennium. It's nowadays the current presidency, the next presidency, and the Commission. Again, you may say, oh, yeah, okay, what's the matter? It's pretty significant if you look at it, because obviously one of the problems before always was that presidencies changed and kind of the institutional memory was gone. What happened last time and how, you know. Nowadays you have the Commission there all the time, which provides kind of an institutional memory in the international negotiations. Plus we have a pretty differentiated internal coordination mechanism. The Council is the main institution in external climate policy, and it has established a working party on international environment where they meet in Brussels to beforehand, before international negotiating sessions, already develop guidelines and policy objectives that are usually adopted in Council conclusions. And this working party is supported by a whole range of expert groups, in which also the different EU member states are represented. It's more than 10 nowadays, I think, of expert groups. Plus, at the international level, the system has also been developed in which that's called lead negotiators and issue leaders, where actually not always the presidency sends its people, but the presidency determines that this guy from the Czech Republic speaks on technology transfer. And that then can continue for 3-4 years, which is also giving more continuity and not this problem of always new people coming in, which we had before in the 1990s. With every presidency, all the negotiators were exchanged, and you can imagine the problems of remembering what was going on last time. So that's also an aspect of EU leadership, and as I said, we'll have a whole session on this whole problematic at the end of November. come back to that. Perhaps, I try to go to the last two sections unless you want to have a break and pose a few questions. But perhaps we should just try to go on. Towards the future, where are we? Towards the Copenhagen Agreement, obviously there's a question mark at the end. There are negotiations ongoing, and they are pursued in what's called tracks, and two different tracks. One is the Kyoto Protocol track, and that is basically under two article provisions. Article 3.9 that provides that industrialized countries should develop new targets for the time after 2012, after this commitment period. And Article 9 that says there should be regular reviews of the protocol altogether. So that provides the mechanisms for transfer of finances and technologies that are on the table again, and even more so than in the past, I think, because they are certainly linked to the mitigation action in developing countries. If they are supposed to implement actions, they need to have the means to do so. And that will be the transfer of finances and technology. That is also connected to adaptation. Adaptation to the impacts of climate change, to rising sea levels, to drought, to all kinds of other impacts that need to be urgently addressed. And one of the major constituencies there certainly is Africa. So that will also have the financial impacts. There is emissions from international transport, aviation and maritime transport, that is, as an issue that was left unresolved in Kyoto. Kyoto basically said the industrialized countries should cooperate in the international organizations that have the main regulatory authority in those areas, namely the International Civil Aviation Organization and the International Maritime Organization, which has led nowhere so far. There is the whole issue that has come up, especially in the last 2 to 3 years, on avoiding, on minimizing deforestation. Deforestation, especially in several developing countries, is one of the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Globally, it's around 20% at the moment. So that has entered the negotiating agenda on how to address that. There is these impacts of response measures that I mentioned before, and there's an etc. afterwards. So there are more issues. Again, I spare you those other issues. I guess the picture gets clear. It's pretty many issues. You can imagine lots of countries stressing one or the other, being particularly interested or particularly opposed to certain measures under those items, which makes it politically tricky, obviously, to find an agreement. Just to also give you an idea of mechanisms for transfer of finances, what we are currently talking about. As I mentioned, we have a number of funds under the UNFCCC. We have this adaptation fund, etc. These are usually, if you count everything together, I guess you come potentially to something like perhaps $1 billion per year or something. I don't think it even reaches that. What's generally talked about in terms of financial transfer that needs to occur in the future from industrialized to developing countries is more in the tens and hundreds of billions per year. So we're certainly talking about serious money. Yeah, it's not clear that that will come from government budgets. And how that exactly might be implemented, but it's serious money. And I'm not convinced anyway that will in the end have 100 billion per year, but certainly quite a substantive strengthening of that aspect. So, to summarize that road to Copenhagen, it will certainly be not an easy road. Many issues, many parties involved, many groups, which is a major challenge for coming to an agreement. You can see it all over the place in international policy and law. You can see it was already written in the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, which took 9 years to come to an agreement, and there are articles out there adding and deducting issues and parties, I think. So that was the solution back then. You exclude certain issues and you exclude certain parties so that you can eventually agree on something. It took 9 years. If you look at the WTO, the Uruguay round agreement, it took like 7 years. Also because the negotiating package got ever bigger in that stage. Look at the Doha round, which started when? 2001? Still not concluded. Still ongoing. Also because the negotiating agenda has grown and there are many, many issues that need to be balanced. What we're trying here is, you also see, an increasing negotiating agenda, a list that gets longer and longer. And the negotiations were really started end of last year, and we're trying to come to an agreement next year, within 2 years. But okay, the urgency is out there. We had the fourth assessment report of the IPCC published last year. We have heads of state and governments dealing with the issue in the G8, in the United Nations General Assembly. Obviously the European Council. The UN Security Council has addressed the matter. So everybody's working towards that goal and target. But the international framework, whatever it looks like in the future, I think it's fair to say that it's not likely to get less complex than it has been, than it is already. Let's say a few words about the EU in that context. Again, basically that will now be the wrap up. The EU has already in Bali been again one of the driving forces for pushing for this Bali roadmap, pushing for trying to get a Copenhagen agreement on the time post 2012. So internationally, the EU is still a driving force, let's say. Then we have obviously had, and we'll address these issues in more detail in the lecture series again, the European Council, especially the 2007 March Council, where the EU unilaterally committed to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 20% by 2020 and increase the share of renewables to 20% by 2020, and kind of without a real commitment, but an endorsement of the target of 20% increase of energy efficiency by 2020. It also added that in the case of an equivalent comparable measures of other industrialized countries and action by advanced developing countries, they would be prepared to go up to minus 30% in the greenhouse gas emission cut by 2020. That was also before Bali and strengthened obviously the EU position in Bali quite a bit. So that needs to be mentioned. Then the challenges to the EU as an international actor that are already mentioned, that will remain obviously, ensuring EU unity within a union that now is 27, or if you include the Commission at the coordination, what's happening now? That will remain a challenge, ensuring EU unity and ensuring effective climate diplomacy so that the EU actually has time and the right strategy for outreach to other parties and for achieving its objectives. Few words again on this, what happened after the European Council in 2007 made this commitment. The European Commission then came forward with a number of proposals, most of them combined in what's called the Climate Energy Package that was proposed in January of this year, which contains a proposal for ETS, another of these abbreviations, emissions trading system, a reform of this emissions trading system, and continuation of it, obviously also until 2020. That's currently under discussion between the Council, the Commission, and the Parliament, the European Parliament. Then a regulation of what's called the effort sharing, which would now address in the proposal by the Commission the part of emissions that's not covered by the emissions trading system anymore. So there's a proposal for that, and there's a proposal for implementing this 20% target for renewable energies also in the Renewables Directive that would establish legally binding targets for the member states, for individual member states to achieve jointly this 20% renewable energy target. And obviously also there has been already before the proposal on CO2 and cars to a regulation that's directly applicable. That's also currently under negotiation. And there are further efforts to address energy efficiency. Aviation has already been decided to be included in the EU emissions trading system this year also. And there might be a proposal forthcoming for including also international maritime transport in the EU emissions trading system. The question that obviously this set of proposals in terms of leadership for the EU also at the international level poses is, will this be sufficient to close the credibility gap that somehow still was out there? And we can discuss that over the course of the lecture series. So, and we'll obviously address these proposals also in several sessions. This is perhaps something also as a background. Let me see how well it, hope you can see that. What it does here is you have in what's supposed to be blue, you have the Kyoto targets of the individual member states. You have the current emission level, which is 2006 data, and you have projections for where countries will be in 2010, so pretty much in the middle of the commitment period, just with the measures that are already adopted, plus use of JI and CDM, and accounting of sinks. So you see, probably not that well, down here is the EU15. The EU15 is at minus 2.7% in 2006 as compared to the target of 8% where we need to get. And if you look at the projections, you are at minus 7.4%, not all with domestic measures but also with CDM credits as I mentioned. So it's a little bit still to be done. In addition, obviously, the projections are uncertain to some extent. And then it varies very much between the member states. You can see that the UK is likely to overachieve its target, the current projections target of minus 12.5, projection of minus 23.7. Spain is at the moment very likely to miss its target without additional measures, obviously. For example, buying CDM credits with a projection of 27% increase. Although that would mean it's where am I? No, Spain is one above. So 29% increase as compared to a target of 15%. You can have a closer look at this, and I guess the next update of these projections and emissions data are due in December of this year, so towards November, December, they usually come out towards the end of the lecture series. So that brings me to the end, and that's to the overview of the lecture series actually. So next week we'll address a little bit more the science policy interface, I'd say, on the session on the EU, the IPCC, and the science of climate change, and especially the 2 degrees Celsius target. That's the target the EU has set. Also for international climate protection, that overall the temperature increase at a global level should not exceed 2 degrees centigrade, which is something many scientists also support. And we'll have a number of scientists here actually who are involved in this process. Bill Hare and Marc of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and Jean-Pascal Seele, who is actually Vice Chair of the IPCC. We'll talk about that. Then we have a session, more generally, again, the overview of what I already hinted at a little bit, the status of EU climate policies, status and the perspective, where Marc and Stefan Singer of WWF will be the speakers. 22nd of October, we'll address CO2 emissions from cars, which I was also talking about today already a little bit, with Malcolm Ferguson of IEEP and Christian Hay of the German Environment Council. 29th of October, the emissions trading scheme, internal and external dimensions, with one thing there of the European Commission and Jörg Vettestad from Norway. 5th of November, adaptation, big issue coming up, with Rosario Bento País from the European Commission and Simon Hook of, was it IEEP? IEEP. Then renewable energy, Jason Anderson from IEEP, and Tom House from the European Commission. On the 19th of November, the prospect for a new international agreement on climate change with Michael Samet-Kutachar and Joyita Gupta. And I should perhaps mention that Michael Samet-Kutachar is the ambassador for climate change of Malta, and he is also the designated chair of the international negotiations for next year. So don't miss that one. The 26th of November, that will be more the issue, how does the EU organize itself in international climate policy, external competence, what are its internal procedures, what's the actual practice, how they're doing that, with Nuno Lacasta from Portugal, who was the head of the Portuguese delegation last year under the Portuguese presidency, EU presidency, and Louise van Schijk from the Netherlands, from the Hague Klingendahl Institute. Then 3 December, transatlantic politics of climate change, obviously particularly interesting also after the US elections at the beginning of November, with Yolanda Schröers, who is a US citizen, teaching in Berlin at the Environmental Policy Center, and Alexander Ochs, who is actually European, a German, who's working in Washington on climate change issues. On the 10th of December, and Marc has to help me with the names or I look into the program, the EU-Russia and climate change with Liebe Duma from the Yasser Institute in The Hague and
Mikhail Kozlevsky.
Okay, from Russia. And on the 17th of December, and I mentioned that actually at the beginning of December the Poznan conference will take place, actually from the 1st to the 13th of December. So you can see the 17th is immediately afterwards. So we'll have Nicola Notaro from the European Commission, from the International Climate Policy Unit, who will talk about how the situation now looks after the Poznan conference. And Laurence Tuliana from the IEEP. Let's put it that way. You find it in the program. My French is not as excellent, so I don't try. So these will talk about the prospects for the coming year after the Poznan conference, which will obviously be supposed to give a major input also to the negotiations next year. So that should also be interesting. And then check our website for January. I mean, that's the official lecture series program, but in January we have the commitment of the Acting Director General of DG Environment to talk about the EU climate energy package, its internal and external implications. Obviously, the assumption is that the EU will adopt that package in December. And on that assumption, we will come to talk about it, because otherwise, obviously, there's not much point in talking about it. So we are assuming, we are optimistic, we think it will be adopted under the French presidency as planned, and then it will happen in January 2009. But because the process is a little bit in flux, he has asked for flexibility with the date, so we'll fix the date as soon as the package is adopted with him and announce it on the website, and perhaps we can already announce it, then that would obviously be the target already during one of the last lectures. So that brings me to an end. Thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, we have 20 minutes for questions. You will find on the web then also, especially I guess for students and people who are interested in further information, a few references on the last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sebastian, for this very comprehensive overview. So we have some time left for questions or comments. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks very much for the talk. It was very informative. I look forward to the remainder of the lecture series. I have a question regarding the EU's position as in the climate change regime, international regime. And of course, the EU has been leading, at least through the 90s, as you correctly pointed out. But it's getting into problems with its own institutional setup, and with the enlargement and other issues such as that. Also, the EU is only responsible for, tell me if I'm wrong, but about 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that it's, which is roughly half of the US or China. And so, is its position actually going to remain as the key actor in the international arena, or is it for institutional and other reasons? Will it actually fall back? And who is actually also out there that is going to push forward that sort of agenda? Is there anybody who can take its place? How's that one?
Well, I guess perhaps Marc also wants to say a few words about that. My take on this would be first on the enlargement issue, perhaps. Obviously, that's posing a challenge. If you look at the evidence so far, you can't really see that after 2004 suddenly there's less progress in European climate policy. I mean, you could even argue the other way around with the European Council decisions last year, commitments, which was a major step forward, despite enlargement perhaps. So that's, but I agree that that still is a challenge, could still evolve and still become more of a problem. It's certainly also true that in the dynamics of the emissions, like the share of the EU declines somehow. So that would speak for less influence. And that's probably also true because only taking emissions as an indicator is probably a little bit too simple. But even if you look at the economic power, then also other regions have been more dynamic in the past. We'll see what the financial crisis does for all that. So I would argue that possibly the EU loses a little bit of influence. And that's in that structural sense, which obviously doesn't need to mean that it becomes less influential internationally. I mean, there's a lot more, I would say, that of potential that the EU has and has not exploited yet in terms of environmental diplomacy and really, being clever and smart instead of only powerful. So soft power, if you want to talk about that one, soft power resources, that it can exploit more. But I guess that could, I don't know, if you talk about Copenhagen, I don't know to what extent that will immediately become relevant, but in the medium to long term, I would think perhaps the EU needs to adapt its strategy in those terms and be aware that it's a big player, but not the biggest one. You mentioned US and China, and frequently you find in the literature that people are saying, and that's probably true, it's China and US in the end that need to find the solution, but perhaps the EU can help in that. So in that sense, you can still have leadership from the EU, but perhaps Marc, you want to add?
Well, not immediately. I will have my turn. But other questions or comments? Yes.
I have two questions. First of all, thank you for the very dense information. And what I ask myself is, well, obviously, this whole negotiation process is very state-driven in the sense that states meet states in all these committees. And my question is how you evaluate the possible impact of non-governmental actors on all this. I mean, they might have been helpful in putting this thing on the international agenda in the first place, but at the current situation, is there something more they could do? And the second question is concerning the Lisbon Treaty. If it will ever be ratified, would that have an impact on ACTA, and would that change some competences in the sense of more supranational competence?
I mean, on non-governmental organizations, I think, well, it's fair to say that this is the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol are certainly international law instruments and as such agreements among states. But that does not mean that NGOs wouldn't have quite a big role to play. And they do play that. They are there at the international negotiations, they influence negotiators, they give information, etc. So that they are influential, and whether they can do more, I don't know. I mean, we can ask Stefan Singer in 2 weeks' time from WWF, who is very much involved in European as well as international climate policy. They have all their strategies, WWF, Greenpeace, etc. So that's the NGO parts. I think one shouldn't. I mentioned them only today and then didn't elaborate a lot more. One could also argue that a lot of the European NGOs are particularly pushy and perhaps support EU leadership in that sense. We could have talked more about that also. Lisbon Treaty, I hope we'll come back on the 26th of November to that. Obviously, as it looks now, it may not have immediate impact on the whole Copenhagen agreement. I actually know that a few people working on external climate policy in the EU are somewhat relieved. You know, not that the Lisbon Treaty doesn't come about that quickly, but that they will not have to deal with the question what exactly that would mean for the negotiating process. As you know, there would be an external action service established, and it's not really quite clear what role that would play in the climate negotiations, and then therefore it's a little bit an open question. But it could change the activeness. It would certainly also change something to the extent that it may enhance the role that the European Parliament would have to play, because ratification would then, after the Lisbon Treaty, also require the consent of the Parliament, which it does not do so far. So in that sense, might also be relevant. But I hope we will come back to that on the 26th of November with Louise and Syke, who would talk about that also, I think.
Certainly, yes. Any others? Yes, please.
My question concerns the Kyoto mechanisms. Do you have any idea to what extent the European Union is making use of these mechanisms? And which countries inside the EU are the ones which make most use of it?
Which countries make most use of it? I don't have quantitative figures in mind. The EU does make use of it. That's one of the negotiating issues actually at the moment with the EU ETS reform. How many credits you can bring in? Whether all of these credits, whether there's a limit to that, and whether the limit applies only to the current commitment period or until the period 2020. So again, a nice entry for the session on the emissions trading reform, where we'll certainly discuss that. I know that the Netherlands have always drawn quite a bit on CDM-JI. I think if you look at the figures, also Spain will have to and already is drawing quite a bit on these, but I don't have the exact figures.
So there's no limit in theory.
There is a limit under the EU emissions trading scheme, but okay, if the governments then would buy something that would be outside the emissions trading scheme, that could happen. That also does not only apply to CDM and JI, but could also be that they actually buy something from Russia, something like that. There is, under the international accord, an agreement that there needs to be domestic action, and these credits should be supplementary. But there's no exact definition what that means. That would need to be clarified, I guess, eventually by the compliance committee if somebody raised the question of implementations that this country is definitely not doing it supplementary, but it's using it as the main means to achieve its target. That's not defined, no.
All right. Yes, please.
I just wanted to add to the question. For instance, the new member states are very progressive in the Kyoto Treaty, but it's not exactly because they would be the most progressive in their policies, but because they had to do all the renovation and investment in the past 10 to 15 years, which is, for instance, why they have big problems with the ETS scheme, when they would have to decrease their emissions, just like the other member states, like the old member states, even though they cut a lot in the past 10 to 15 years. So they kind of had to buy the newest technology, because in the past 10 years there was already the new technology on the market. So they're kind of trying to get their exceptions, which they will not get. But particularly Hungary and also Czech Republic, they are under their, they have cut a lot. And they are in the parliament trying to kind of position themselves as, you know, we've done so much in the past, why do we have to have as many cuts as the other member states? But that's politically never going to happen, but they're trying to kind of argue for that. So they're very progressive because they had to renew their economies and invest a lot in the past years.
So basically well, again, that will be for later sessions, but what has happened in the Commission proposal is, if you take the base year of 1990, as is established, and look at where the new member states are, many of them are -20, -30, -40%, and that looks pretty good. But what the Commission did in its proposal said, we take the year 2005, actually the first one where we really have the best emissions data from the EU ETS, and take that as a base year. And by the way, well, they based this whole thing obviously on an impact assessment and said they have reduced pretty much already, but our impact assessment says if we want to share the effort, then you actually need to do more. Whereas I think some of the new member states had perceived that perhaps they would be allowed to increase more. So I think for some of them that was a little bit of a shock. And that's still under negotiation. There's this initiative by Hungary to change that, and a number of the new member states have joined them. Indeed. So again, something for 15th, 29th of October, I think, to explore more in depth.
Okay, well, in the back, that will be the final question.
A little technical question of the new slide. Technical. So
Yes, please.
how reliable the data on emissions is, and what is the methodology for calculating the current situation for emissions by country?
In the EU or internationally or both?
Primarily in the EU, of course.
In the EU, obviously, I mean, that's why the Commission used the 2005 base for the new proposal. I think, well, they have a reporting system nationally, and under the EU ETS, even a verification system for emissions of individual installations. That needs to be obviously under the system. Well, I'm not a technical expert, but my own assessment would be that the European emission figures are relatively reliable. I think if you talk about the broader international picture, then it's We heard about in recent weeks also that China now has overtaken the US as the major global emitter. I think there's a lot more uncertainty there. Probably the ballpark is roughly clear. But that's one of the issues in the international negotiations at the moment. Okay, if you want to have actions by, for example, China, and then they should enter the global emissions trading market, then you need to have really reliable data, and then people look there and say, we don't really have reliable data. I mean, really that we can say this sector emits that amount of tons, and we can really say it for certain. So there's a lot of more infrastructure work there needed, I guess, to get the data and collect the data.
I guess the answer is that if you think of figures at the country level, macroeconomic level, certainly the data are quite reliable because these emissions are calculated based on energy consumption and other macroeconomic statistics. But as the experience with the emissions trading system in the early years in the EU demonstrated, the data at the individual company level, etc., was still pretty unreliable in many member states. And one of the consequences of having these measures in place is that the quality of the data has been improved quite steadily. All right. Would you like to have the last word?
Definitely not. I just have a question. If you have in mind with numbers or in any way an assessment of what would happen if the EU would pass this ETS directive with the exclusion of energy-intensive industries, would it have a big impact on the overall targets and as a preparation for Poznan in Copenhagen? If we don't agree, to cut emissions in those areas, then it's probably difficult to be an example to the others or to be, have a strong position when you negotiate. Do you think it's going to have a strong impact at all? Or do you have any numbers, like what's the difference of emissions cuts if you exclude the energy industries or if you keep them in?
Well, again, we'll have sessions about that later on. But I don't think there's a discussion at the moment to exclude energy-intensive industries, but to allocate emission allowances for free to them, which is a little bit different. They would still have a limit on the emissions, but they wouldn't have to pay for them in the first place. But the general significance of adopting that climate energy package for the international level is obvious, as you say. I mean, if the EU can show that they're going ahead and that they're implementing measures and that things are in place, that will certainly strengthen a lot the EU negotiating position towards Copenhagen. And that is the major reason why everybody tries so hard to have an agreement this year, because that still will need to be adopted formally by the Parliament, and we know there are elections upcoming in June next year. So if it hasn't happened by then it would be after Copenhagen, and that would be, for the international negotiating position, not that good, if not to say a disaster.
All right, well, thank you very much for your... we look forward to seeing you again next week.